Hi, everyone. Welcome to Armed with Reason, hosted by GVpedia. This is our very first attempt at a new podcast where we will take some time to discuss gun violence prevention and the data and statistics and the work that GVpedia does to hopefully bring some improvement to the gun violence arena here in this country. So before we start, just a quick disclaimer. Some listeners might find the topic of gun violence to be traumatizing. We absolutely understand and respect that. So we just ask that you please proceed with caution and, of course, take care of yourself. That's most important. So today on the podcast, you have Devin Hughes, and my name is Caitlin Clarkson Pereira. And I'm going to pass it over to Devin for a moment so that he can introduce himself to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Devin Hughes. I'm the president and founder of GVpedia. I found GVpedia back in 2017. I've been working in the gun violence space since 2013. And it's great to have this new endeavor. And as you've probably noticed, or as mentioned, this is our first take on this. So we will see how this goes. So bear with us for any technical difficulties or anything else that might arise. Again, this is our first attempt at doing this.
I'm all for the candid nature of first attempts, though, so I hope our listeners appreciate it as well. So, and my name again is Caitlin. I'm the executive director of GVpedia. I've been on board here with Devin for 3.5 years now. Oh my goodness, time flies.
Yeah.
You're living through a pandemic, I guess. So it's really been fantastic to work with Devin and with the rest of our team and with GVpedia in general to make sure that we are bringing the issues forward in a bipartisan manner so that the gun violence prevention legislation that is presented and written and voted into law is what's the best for us and for our families and for the rest of the citizens of this country. So gun violence prevention has always been something that is really important to me. And then I unfortunately don't live very far from Sandy Hook, Connecticut. So those of us who live close in a geographical manner, unfortunately, were touched by that tragedy rather closely. And that really was a catalyst for me to get involved in this movement in a bigger way. So here we are. We, especially as this is our first attempt, we're not going to take too much time today to jump into a topic with much depth, but we do want to touch on something that we started to present on last week in a session that we call GVpedia Explains. And these are sessions that we've been doing every month, every couple of months for the past couple of years, where we get into more detail about a variety of topics in the gun violence prevention movement. And the topic from a couple of weeks ago was called GVpedia Explains the Defensive Gun Use Myth. When we say defensive gun use, you will often see it written down as DGU. So just for any of our listeners who might not be aware of that. And it was great to see that even in the height of summer, we had quite a few folks in attendance, and we actually had a lot of questions that were submitted to us about defensive gun use. The session was only an hour, so we didn't have an opportunity to answer all of those questions, but we figured that this would be the perfect place to go into the topic a little bit deeper and give folks a different medium to learn about defensive gun use. As if you're listening to this audio, you're listening on Spotify with us. So first, Devin, if it works for you, I'm going to ask you to explain in 2 or 3 minutes what defensive gun use is. We just want to make sure that anybody who's tuning in today is aware of what it is, so they can get a better understanding for the questions that we'll answer for them.
Yeah, and so be sure to hold a stopwatch on me, because 2 to 3 minutes for me can often turn into 10 to 15. But at a basic level, defensive gun use is when a citizen fires, brandishes, or reveals a firearm in an attempt to stop an assailant from committing or completing a crime. So basically, someone sees a crime occurring either against them, their property, or someone else in the vicinity, and they pull a gun to try to stop it. And unfortunately, the definition that we're stuck with there is really vague, because the line between offensive and defensive gun use, as we'll get into, can be very hazy. And what actually constitutes a defensive gun use is often in the eye of the beholder, because if somebody just announces they have a gun, that's not typically treated as a defensive gun use. So at the end of the day, if somebody uses a gun in a defensive manner, that's going to be considered a defensive gun use, at least in academia and typically in the courts as well. Was I under 2 minutes?
You did great. I am shocked right now. This is fantastic. And any of our loyal listeners are going to be super impressed. So hats off to you, Devin. And in addition to the definition of defensive gun use, can you touch base on the report that we just completed and published? It was a 12-part report, really going into detail about some of the nuances of defensive gun use, but maybe you can speak for a couple minutes about what you found when you were doing the research for that report.
Yes, back to the stopwatch again.
Yes, back to the stopwatch, stopwatch.
Yeah, and as we've indicated, like, this was a 12-part report, and part of the thing that's difficult with what we do at GVpedia is that a lot of these myths that we try to debunk are often very complicated and don't necessarily present themselves in a bite-sized fashion. And so one of the continuous struggles that we face is, how do we break down these complicated and really deep and detailed myths in a way that can almost fit on a bumper sticker? And the gun lobby has been very successful at translating their myths into bumper stickers, and there needs to be efforts there. And one of the things we're doing at GVP is trying to do that. So, having used up about a minute of my time, the three main questions we sought to answer with the defensive gun use myth is whether defensive gun use is common, whether it's beneficial for society, and if it's more effective than alternative means of self-defense. And the simple answer to all three of those questions is no. So gun violence archive data shows that there are approximately 2,000 verified defensive gun uses annually. That's in stark contrast to the millions of defensive gun uses the gun lobby claims occur every single year. Defensive gun use is not beneficial for society. There are far more offensive uses than defensive uses. And even when looking at the surveys that provide the millions of defensive gun uses claims, when you actually look at those responses, you find that the majority of those responses indicate illegal gun use or offensive gun use. So even in the context of defensive gun use itself, most reported defensive gun uses are actually illegal uses. And finally, surveys consistently show that defensive gun use is not more effective than alternative means of self-defense. Using any other type of weapon, or running away, or calling the police, or even doing nothing have the same or lower rates of injury than using a gun in self-defense. So on all three questions of whether it's common, beneficial for society, or more effective than alternative means, the simple answer is no, it's not. And that really strikes at the core of the defensive gun use myth.
Right. And especially in this COVID, post-COVID sort of world where there was obviously a lot of fear for a variety of different reasons, but we saw a spike not only in gun violence, but in gun sales. We saw purchasers who have never owned a weapon before going out and buying their first gun or guns. We saw people applying for licenses to buy guns go through the roof. And so it feels like the myth is even more damaging today than it was 3 or 4 years ago, because there are people who before didn't necessarily have to worry about what defensive gun use meant because they didn't have a gun readily available in their home, but now they might. Is that true?
Yeah, and it's evidence of just how effective the gun lobby's marketing has been around defensive gun use, because you had people who never before considered purchasing a firearm, saw the lockdowns and then the violence that occurred in the summer, police violence, and then protests, and then just basically a full breakdown of trust between the community and police. And people in those times of uncertainty, when you have a global pandemic going around the world, went for safety. And for many people, safety meant a firearm. And when you look at internal documents from the gun lobby, this is exactly the plan, basically, where you have the NRA's information division director in 2021 talking about how no matter the policy or whatever happens, their messaging continues to focus on self-defense. It's a very deliberate strategy, and it's been occurring over decades. So while we've definitely seen the spike in the past 3 to 4 years and since the pandemic, this has been ongoing since the 1980s and 90s. And so we're kind of seeing the leading edge at this point that has convinced a majority of Americans that firearms make them safer, and that more people carrying in public will keep society safer, even at the same time that an overwhelming majority of Americans want stronger gun laws, such as universal background checks, permit to purchase, extreme risk protection orders, child access prevention laws, and all those. So while majority of people support those, they also think guns make them safer. And that's a very detrimental myth.
Can you share a little insight into the myth and what the reality is when it comes to the numbers, but what the more common numbers are that we pass around, right? Like they're very different. There's a huge spectrum of numbers that we hear, but what might we expect somebody that we're speaking to who is loosely aware of defensive gun use, what might they say are the number of times a defensive gun use happens every year in the United States?
Yeah, so there are approximately 2,000 verified defensive gun uses annually, which now some pro-gun pushback to that is, well, not everybody reports defensive gun uses to the police, but the very surveys they rely on to show millions of defensive gun uses indicates that more than half of people report defensive gun uses to the police, or the police find out about the incident. And so there should be a record there. And yet we're only able to find 2,000 instead of 2.5 million. And when you look at the individual risk with having a firearm in the home, a firearm doubles your risk of homicide and triples your risk of suicide. And you're overwhelmingly something anywhere from like 40 times to many more times more likely to have a gun in the home harm someone in your family than actually be used defensively. So there's a vast disconnect between the idea that guns make you safer and the reality where it substantially increases your risks.
You can tell that you and I spent too much time conversing, because that was actually going to be what I was going to ask you next, was what's the actual risk related to having a weapon, a gun in the home? And those numbers don't lie, and those numbers are staggering, right? We think about a parent having a gun next to the bed, let's say, or under the bed or in the closet to protect their family, their children, this sort of like mama, papa bear visual, if somebody were to be breaking into their house. But the reality is that it is far more likely that that gun is going to be used to harm them or one of their children than them needing to use it to intimidate an intruder.
Yeah, and it's also far more likely to be stolen as well. One of the things that is often overlooked in the gun violence discussion is people often see it as like, oh, you have responsible gun owners on one side and then criminals on the other. And while that's not a terribly serious way of looking at the world in such a stark contrast, like very often it's arguments and such. But even if you are a responsible gun owner who's never used your guns to harm anyone, which to be clear is the overwhelming majority of gun owners, there's still the risk of those firearms being stolen. There's more than 200 and possibly 300,000 firearms stolen every single year in the United States. And those guns are being stolen from everyday people and also potentially gun stores as well, but mostly from people. And then those guns get diverted to the underground market for firearms, and that further fuels gun violence. And so while the firearm in the home poses a risk to those in the home, if it gets stolen, it poses a risk to everybody else as well. And one of the simplest things people can do is make sure that they lock up their firearms, to make sure that kids can't access it, as well as people who want to just smash and grab the firearm. There's far too many cases where somebody has NRA bumper stickers, parked their car somewhere, and somebody just sees that as an invitation, breaks the window, looks in the glove box, and sure enough, there's a gun. And we'll do this dozens upon dozens of times. And that pipeline needs to be halted, but that's going slightly further afield from the defensive gun use debate specifically.
Don't worry, safe storage, friends, will be another topic for another day. But that's a really great point, right? There's individuals in all realms who are appreciative of all sorts of laws, or they're passionate about certain projects, or they give away the things that are important to them based on the stickers and the identification they put on their car, right? And so the assumption is, if you see certain stickers on a car, that, hey, it's certainly more than likely that there could be a weapon in here at some point. And unfortunately, we know that oftentimes those individuals looking for those cars with those stickers are correct. So I do really appreciate the point that you made, right? Having having a gun and thinking you might need it for defensive gun use, especially if it's not stored properly, it's not only more dangerous for you, it's more dangerous for everybody else, right? We have no idea what happens to that.
Yeah, and there was a study in 2002, I think, by Philip Cook that actually looked at a community level of whether guns serve as a deterrent or an inducement to crime, because they can be either theoretically. And that study found it was far more of an inducement. Like, criminals who wanted to do harm to others or wanted to turn a quick profit saw guns as a very easy way to do that, and as rich hunting grounds, as it were, unfortunately.
Right.
And it's important to recognize that.
Well, maybe not surprisingly, there's still about a dozen more questions that we should get to answer, but I don't want us to get too carried away and too excited that we've been able to manage this for the couple of minutes that we've been on together. But before we wrap up our intro episode, or pilot episode, if you will, I want to let our listeners know that all of this sort of stemmed from our Substack, which we launched in the springtime in April, which is called Armed with Reason. So please feel free to check that out and subscribe there, either for free, or if you would like to be a paid contributor, we certainly always appreciate that as well. That money goes back into making sure that the Substack is alive and well. And this is a completely new medium for us here in the podcast world. And while there are some topics that are pretty obvious that I'm sure we will be happy to cover at certain points in the near future, if there's something that you have a question about, or a topic that's of specific importance to legislation that might be coming up in your state, or something that your organization is passionate about and would like to learn more about, this is certainly the space for us to have these sorts of conversations. We understand that sometimes the data and the academics of all this can get a little complicated and convoluted, but we do our best here to make sure that we are delivering the information to you in a way that you and your fellow gun violence prevention advocates can use to your advantage, and hopefully to change minds and impact legislation for the better. So Devin, before I say farewell in a way that I'm not sure how to do because this is the first time I'm doing so, do you have anything you would like to add?
Yeah, and in addition, if you have any guests that you want to or want us to have on the podcast, please let us know. Like for our first podcast, we decided it'd be safest if it was just the two of us speaking in case there's any technical difficulties or as we're figuring out what we're actually doing with this,
Right.
that this was safest. But in the coming weeks, we plan on having a variety of guests on and talking with them about a variety of issues. So if there's a particular issue you specifically want us to dive into, like we're more than open to those recommendations as well as specific guests going forward. But yeah, we look forward to doing this semi-regularly, and we also welcome your feedback. As you can probably tell that with the lack of intro music and cut scenes and like I am standing here on the outskirts of such and such a place sort of reporting, this is a relatively low budget endeavor, and we hope to keep this relatively casual and just having conversations with people going forward. And if this eventually turns into something slightly more high budget, like by all means, but we're just happy to have any and all recommendations and having these important conversations. So if you've managed to listen this far, thank you for listening. And we look forward to future episodes.
Yes. And I'm going to get me one of those snazzy little microphones that Devin has there because I'm kind of jealous. So look for that in the next episode. And also one thing that I'll ask, maybe post on our social media, is if our listeners would prefer 20 minutes, 40 minutes, what sort of
2 hours.
No, 2 hours. Don't worry, everyone. I'm going to put the kibosh on that, but we want to make sure that we are putting out content that works for you and your lives, and that you can find it useful and easy to listen to and access. So that's it for today and our first episode here on Armed with Reason. And assuming that I can figure out how to stop this from recording without losing all of this wonderful information that we just shared here, that'll be a great day. All right. Thanks, Devin. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.